In a land where water is worth more than a man's life, former lawman Rylan Creed rides into Blackthorn Hollow expecting another job, another paycheck, another sin he'll carry until the desert finally buries him. But when he discovers that the woman he's been hired to scare, a widowed rancher named Mara Ellery, and her fragile young son are the last thing standing between a ruthless land baron and a dying town's only water source, Rylan faces a truth he's spent a lifetime outrunning. Some battles aren't about money, and some people are worth bleeding for. And when the sun sets behind Dustwater Ridge, the hunters who came for Mara will realize the one man they should have feared is the one trying to save her. The desert wind crawled across Blackthorn Hollow like something half alive, dragging heat, dust, and the bitter smell of old gunpowder as Rylan Creed rode in slow, shoulders stiff beneath the weight of too many miles and too many regrets. His coat flapping behind him like the last torn page of a life that never went the way he meant it to, and the townspeople watched him with that quiet, fearful stillness that always followed him from one dying settlement to the next. Because a man who carried his past the way he did could only be one of two things: danger, or the warning before it. Rylan didn't want trouble, but trouble stuck to him like desert sand, and the closer he came to the heart of the town, the more the silence around him tightened until even the horses in the corral turned their heads away, as if they sensed something cold walking beside him. Blackthorn Hollow wasn't on any map worth reading. It was the kind of place people came to when they were running from debt, sin, or someone meaner than themselves, the kind of place where the sheriff drank himself to sleep at noon, and the preacher nailed the church door shut because even God, it seemed, had stopped visiting. Rylan tied his horse to the rail outside Pike's saloon and stepped down with a slow, heavy breath, boots hitting the dirt with the sound of a man carrying every mistake he'd ever made. He walked through the swinging doors, and the room fell silent so fast it felt like the world had been pulled underwater. Men froze with cards half raised. A woman sitting near the back lowered her glass like she didn't want to make a sound. The piano player dropped his hands to his lap without turning around. Rylan kept walking until he reached the bar, where Jetter Pike, thin, gray, and shaky as a fence in a storm, tried to look him in the eye and failed halfway. Rylan didn't ask for whiskey. He didn't sit. He just said, in a low voice that made the lamps flicker, "I'm looking for Mara Ellery." And if the room had been quiet before, now it felt hollow, like the whole damn world took one step back from him. Someone whispered a curse. Someone else muttered a prayer. Pike swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around a glass he wasn't even holding. "You don't want to go there, Creed," he said, voice trembling like a man standing in the shadow of his own grave. "She's had enough men come sniffing around, enough threats, enough bad news." Rylan leaned in a fraction, the brim of his hat casting his face into shadow. "Not asking what she's had. I'm asking where she is." Pike hesitated, eyes darting toward the corner of the room, where a broad-shouldered ranch hand had stood up slowly, arms crossed, jaw clenched. The man's voice was low and angry when he spoke. "Who sent you?" And there it was, the question that always came sooner or later, the one that tasted like blood and bad choices. Rylan didn't answer, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Pike exhaled shakily and said the name everyone feared, the name that made even the walls seem to draw back. Thorn Maddock. Rylan didn't react, not outwardly, but something cold shifted inside him, something old and heavy, because Maddock wasn't a man who threatened. He erased. "Mara's got a ranch east of town," Pike finally said, voice barely more than a whisper. "Her husband died last winter. Fever took him fast. Left her with a boy, Jack. Kid don't weigh more than a sack of flour, but he's got something in him. Something Maddock don't like in people. Rylan knew before Pike even finished saying it. "Hope?" the bartender murmured, eyes dropping to the worn counter. The boys still got hope. Rylan turned without another word, and the doors creaked behind him as he stepped back into the dying sunlight, where the ridge glowed orange like a fire waiting to burn everything down. He stood there a moment, staring toward the east, where a widow and her boy held onto a piece of land a monster wanted, and he felt the old weight settle deeper in his bones, the kind that told him he wasn't walking toward a job. He was walking toward a reckoning. Night settled over the Ellery Ranch like a bruise spreading across the sky, and Rylan Creed stood at the edge of the porch, watching the darkness stretch itself wide across the plains, as if the land were trying to warn him that men like Thorne Maddock didn't give up just because one hired gun decided to grow a conscience. And Mara watched him from the doorway, arms crossed tight against the cold, her eyes carrying that tired, battered strength found only in people who've been forced to fight for far too long. Jack Ellery sat on the porch steps beside Rylan, legs too small to reach the ground, trying to look brave even though every sound out on the prairie made him flinch just a little. Rylan noticed it all, the way the boy's fingers tightened around the wood, the way his eyes kept drifting toward the barn, as if waiting for something to step out of the shadows. Mara finally broke the silence, her voice low and sharp as flint. "Why would Maddock send a man like you?" Rylan didn't turn. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of her question sinking into the boards beneath his boots. "Because men like me don't ask questions," he said. "We do the job. We walk away." Mara stepped closer, her presence steady as a desert oak. And what changed? Rylan took a long breath, slow and pained. "I saw you. Saw the boy. Saw what Maddock was trying to take." Mara didn't respond, but her silence felt louder than any accusation she could have thrown. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the yard in thin, pale ribbons, and somewhere out in the dark, a lone coyote screamed, sharp, long, broken. Jack shivered. Rylan finally turned to face Mara. In the lantern light, he could see the exhaustion carved into her cheeks, the determination in her jaw, the fear she tried hard not to let the boy see. "Maddock's comin', Mara," Rylan said quietly. "Not tonight, maybe, but soon, and he ain't the patient type." Mara looked past him toward the well, the only good water for miles, the reason Maddock had sent threats, sent men, and would soon come himself. "I know," she whispered. "I've known since the first letter arrived." The memory darkened her expression, and Rylan didn't need her to tell him what had been written. Maddock didn't make threats. He wrote promises. Jack finally spoke, his voice small but steady. "Mr. Creed, are you going to help us?" Rylan looked down at the thin, frightened boy, who shouldn't have had to ask that question in the first place, and something inside him, something old, rusted, and long abandoned, shifted. "I'm here," he said. "Ain't leavin'." For the first time that night, Jack smiled. Just a flicker, just long enough to knock something loose in Rylan's chest, something he wasn't ready to name. Mara stepped closer, her voice barely louder than the wind. "You know he'll kill you for switching sides." Rylan nodded. "Wouldn't be the first man who tried." Mara studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for something she wasn't sure she'd find, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, tired, but not afraid. "Then we better start preparing." She walked toward the barn, lantern swinging at her side. Jack followed her, and Rylan stayed on the porch a moment longer, staring into the dark and feeling the night pressing in on him like a warning wrapped in silence. Something was wrong. He didn't know what yet, but the prairie was too still, too expectant, as if holding its breath for something violent about to tear through it. He stepped off the porch and walked toward the fence line, eyes scanning the horizon, every instinct sharpened by years of doing the wrong things for the wrong men. Then he saw it, a distant glint, brief, metallic, like moonlight bouncing off a rifle barrel. Rylan's jaw tightened. They weren't coming soon. They were already here. Dawn crept over the plains with a muted, blood-colored sky, the kind that whispered death long before a man ever heard a gunshot. And Rylan Creed stood at the northern ridge of the Ellery Ranch, his breath slow and controlled as he scanned the distant hills for the men he knew were coming, the men Thorne Maddox sent when patience finally ran dry. Mara and Jack were behind him in the house, the windows boarded, the doors bolted, the well covered with fresh planks. They'd worked through the night reinforcing everything they could, but Rylan knew boards and nails wouldn't stop the kind of cruelty Maddox raised from the dirt. He could feel it in the ground beneath his boots, a low tremor like the earth itself was bracing for blood. His horse stamped anxiously beside him, sensing something wrong in the air, and for a brief second, Rylan let his hand rest on the animal's neck, grounding himself the way he'd done as a kid back when the world felt simple, before violence became the only language he understood. When he finally spotted dust rising in the distance, slow, deliberate, calculated, his jaw locked. Not riders in a rush, no panic, no recklessness. Professionals, Maddox best. The kind of men who didn't miss, didn't hesitate, and didn't leave survivors unless they had orders. Rylan stepped off the ridge and moved toward the house, boots crunching the frost-bitten dirt as a hard wind cut across the land. Inside, he found Mara tying back her hair with shaking hands, her rifle leaning against the table. She looked up too quickly, and he knew she'd been listening for him with every beat of her heart. "Is it time?" she asked, her voice thin but steady. "It's startin'," Rylan said. "They'll be here within the hour." Jack stood behind her, small shoulders squared, trying to hide the fear trembling through him, and Rylan crouched to meet the boy eye to eye. "You remember what I told you?" Jack nodded. "Stay low. Don't look out the windows. Don't open the door." "And?" Rylan asked. "Don't try to be brave," Jack whispered, and Rylan's chest tightened at the words because they didn't belong in a child's mouth. "Good," he said softly. "You're doing just fine." Mara's eyes flicked to Rylan's gun belt, at the worn leather, the scratches carved into the handle from countless draws, the black powder stains that never washed away. "How many?" she asked. Rylan didn't sugarcoat it. 8 riders, maybe 10. Could be more hiding beyond the ridge. Mara's fingers tightened on the rifle. "You can't take that many alone." "I ain't alone," Rylan said, glancing toward her and Jack. But she shook her head, stepping closer, her voice thick with something he wasn't ready to name. "I mean it. You can't die out there." Rylan met her eyes, tired, determined, desperate, and something warm and painful twisted deep in his chest. "I ain't planning to," he said before turning toward the door, because he couldn't stand to look at her any longer without losing the edge he needed to survive. Outside, the wind carried the faint rhythmic thud of hooves. The riders were closer now, the dust trail growing, the shape of armed silhouettes cutting into the haze. Rylan unholstered his revolver, spun the cylinder with a practiced flick, and checked each round by sound alone, listening for the clean metallic click that told him the chamber was perfect. He walked toward the open land, away from the house, away from the people Maddock wanted to break, and he planted himself between the approaching riders and the Ellery Ranch with the posture of a man who'd already dug his own grave and simply refused to lie in it. The riders slowed when they saw him, one man against a small army, and the lead gunman, a scar-jawed enforcer named Colt Avery, pulled off his glove and raised a hand, signaling his men to halt. "Creed," Avery called, voice carrying across the open field. "Didn't think you had it in you to switch sides." Rylan didn't move, didn't blink. Didn't think Maddock had to send boys to do a man's work. The men behind Avery shifted, insult simmering in their silence, but Avery only smirked, the kind of amused cruelty Rylan knew too well. "We ain't here to kill the woman," Avery said. "Just need the land. Maddock's orders." "Then ride back and tell him the answer's no," Rylan replied. Avery sighed like a disappointed parent. "You know how this ends." "Yeah," Rylan said softly, lifting his gun. "I do." The moment Rylan lifted his revolver, the world seemed to contract into a thin electric line stretched tight between him and the riders. Every breath, every heartbeat, every shifting grain of dust hanging in the air like the land itself was bracing for the first gunshot. And Avery smiled that jagged smile of a man who'd already pictured the bodies he would leave behind. "Boys," he said quietly, "send Creed to hell." The riders fanned out like a dark-winged flock, rifles rising in practiced unison, and Rylan drew first, faster than instinct, faster than thought, faster than the memory of every fight that had carved his life into scars and empty whiskey bottles. The crack of his gun tore through the morning stillness, shattering it into 1,000 jagged echoes across the plains. Avery's hat flew off as the bullet skimmed past his cheek, close enough to slice skin, but not close enough to end him. The riders erupted into motion, horses kicking up a storm of dust as bullets snapped through the air like angry bees. Rylan dove behind an old feed trough, splinters exploding around him as rifle rounds punched through the wood. He returned fire with sharp, controlled shots, dropping one rider clean from his saddle and forcing 2 others to scatter wide. He moved low, fast, instinct guiding him where reason couldn't. Years of violence had shaped him into something lean, precise, and dangerous, something Maddock's men had massively underestimated. But they were too many, too disciplined, too relentless. Rylan rolled as another bullet skimmed his sleeve, tearing fabric. His revolver clicked empty. He reloaded on instinct, fingers working quick despite the trembling that always followed close-range gunfire, and he spotted Avery circling wide, eyes burning with murder. "You're outnumbered, Creed," Avery shouted, "and you're running out of land to hide behind." Rylan fired back, not to hit him, but to force him to duck. The riders closed in from both sides, trying to flank him, and he knew the trough wouldn't hold much longer. He sprinted toward a fallen fence line, sliding behind the broken posts just as the trough exploded into wooden shrapnel under a hail of gunfire. Splinters stung his neck, but he kept moving, kept firing, kept breathing. In the distance, he saw something that made his gut twist. Mara standing in the doorway of the house, Jack clinging to her skirt, both watching the battle with wide, terrified eyes. "Get inside!" Rylan shouted, his voice ripping out raw. But Mara didn't move until he pointed and roared again. "Now!" She vanished into the house, slamming the door, and Rylan felt a wave of relief crash through him. But it was swallowed instantly by the cold realization that he couldn't let the gunfight drift any closer to them. He had to pull Maddock's men the other direction. He stood, fired 2 more shots, and sprinted toward the open plain, making himself the obvious target, and the riders took the bait immediately. Bullets tore through the ground at his heels as he ran across the hard dirt, boots slipping in loose patches of sand, lungs burning with each desperate breath. He dove behind a boulder near the ridge and peeked over the edge. 5 riders still on him, Avery among them, all closing fast. Rylan knew he couldn't hold them off for long. He needed an edge. He needed something brutal and unexpected. He scanned the ground and saw a glint of rust, an old cattle chain half buried in the dirt. Not much, but enough for a desperate man to gamble his life on. He hooked it around the base of the boulder and wrapped the other end around his forearm. Then he waited. The riders thundered closer, hooves shaking the earth, rifles raised, dust clouds churning behind them like a moving storm. Avery leaned forward in his saddle, lining up the kill shot. Ryland stood. 1 second, 2, 3. He yanked the chain with everything he had. The boulder tipped forward, then rolled, then lunged down the slope like a dying giant. The lead riders had only a heartbeat to react before the massive rock slammed into them, sending horses screaming and men tumbling in a violent crash of dust, bone, and chaos. Ryland didn't hesitate. He charged the wreckage, firing at any rider still reaching for a weapon, finishing the job before they could rise. Avery's horse had thrown him clear, and he staggered to his feet with blood running down his temple, hatred twisting his features into something less than human. "You son of a..." he growled, raising his pistol, but Ryland tackled him before he could finish, both men slamming into the dirt in a flurry of fists, grit, and fury. Avery swung hard, his knuckles cracking against Ryland's jaw, but Ryland didn't fall back. He grabbed Avery's wrist, twisted it until the bone creaked, and drove his fist into Avery's ribs again and again, each blow fueled by years of guilt and a lifetime of choices that had brought him to this exact moment. Avery spat blood and laughed, a broken, breathless sound. "You think you can protect that woman? That kid? Matt'll burn this whole damn ranch to the ground. He'll bury you beside it." Ryland slammed his fist into Avery's face, finally knocking him out cold, and for a long second he remained there, kneeling in the dirt, chest heaving, knuckles bleeding, mind spinning with the truth Avery had laid bare. Thorn Maddock wouldn't stop. Not with riders. Not with threats. Not with failure. He would come himself. And when he did, he would bring hell with him. The sun barely pushed over the horizon, a thin, dying streak of gold across a sky-bruised purple. When Ryland Creed realized the fight against Maddox's riders had only been the warning shot of a much darker storm, because as he dragged the unconscious Avery toward the barn to tie him up, the ground beneath his boots trembled. Not like hooves, not like horses, but heavier, steadier, deliberate in a way only a monster with money, power, and no soul could move, and Ryland's blood went cold as he stepped outside and saw them cresting the far ridge. A full column of riders draped in black dusters, rifles across their saddles, and at the front of them all sat Thorn Maddock himself, straight-backed, cold-eyed, and calm as a man arriving to collect a debt he believed the world owed him. The man looked untouched by the desert, untouched by life, his coat pristine, his hat spotless, his face carved in the kind of stillness that didn't come from discipline. It came from cruelty practiced until it became religion. Ryland stepped into the center of the yard, gun holstered, but hands ready, heart steadying itself the way a man accepts he's standing at the edge of his last sunrise. Mara watched through the sliver of a window, breath frozen, while little Jack pressed against her leg, whispering, "Is that him?" And Mara, unable to lie, unable to soften the truth, nodded with a heaviness that made her shoulders sag. Maddox's riders spread across the yard with the precision of trained killers, surrounding the ranch in a tightening ring of dust and gun barrels, and Maddox rode forward until his horse stood nose to nose with Ryland's. For a long, stretched moment, the only sound between them was the wind brushing against the well cover. Mara's well, the one Maddox wanted to steal, even if it meant burning a family out of existence. "Creed," Maddox finally said, his voice smooth, hollow, and dangerous. "You disappoint me." Ryland didn't blink. "Ain't the first time I've disappointed a man worse than you." Maddox's lips curved into a faint, almost bored smile. "You killed my riders." Ryland shrugged. "Your riders tried killing a kid." The smile vanished. Maddox leaned slightly forward. "Move aside. This land isn't theirs. It isn't yours. It's mine. The woman and the boy can walk away if they leave the well behind. But if they resist—" His eyes sharpened into something predatory. "I erase them. And you." Ryland stepped closer, close enough to see the faint reflection of himself in Maddox's revolver handle. "You best turn around," he said quietly, "before that arrogance gets you buried." Maddox stared at him for a long, thin second, and then he laughed, a soft, amused sound that sent a ripple through the riders like they were hearing the signal to kill. "You always were a foolish dog," Maddox whispered. Ryland's jaw tightened. "Maybe, but I bite." Maddox snapped his fingers. Riders lifted rifles. Ryland drew. The air split open with the first gunshot, a violent crack that sent horses rearing and dust exploding upward as Ryland Creed rolled behind the water trough, bullets tearing through the wood in sharp, vicious bursts, splinters flying past his face as he fired back with deadly precision, each shot pulling another one of Maddox's riders out of the saddle, their bodies hitting the dirt with dull, heavy thuds that shook the ground beneath him. Mara flinched at every sound inside the house, clutching Jack close as the boy cried silently into her skirt, his small shoulders trembling with a terror he tried so hard to hide, and she whispered, "Stay down, baby. Stay down," even though her voice broke on the words. Outside, Ryland moved with the raw, instinctive violence of a man who had lived too long on the sharp edges of death. He sprinted to the side of the barn, using the smoke from shattered lanterns to mask his position, and the world narrowed into flashes of muzzle fire, screams swallowed by dust, and the ringing in his ears that came every time he stepped into the kind of battle most men never survived. Maddox watched from horseback, calm, calculating, untouched by the chaos, his cold eyes tracking Ryland with quiet fury as if he were studying a disobedient animal that refused to die on command. "Push forward," Maddox ordered, and his riders surged with ruthless precision, moving in a deadly wave that curved around the barn and swept toward the porch where Mara and Jack hid. Ryland saw the shift, felt it like a knife twisting under his ribs, and he broke cover, running straight into the open with gunfire cracking around him like lightning, bullets slicing the air so close he could feel their heat brush his cheek. He shot one rider off his horse, then another, but a third slammed into him from the side, knocking him to the ground as they rolled through dirt and broken glass, fists flying, blood spraying, boots scraping against the earth in a violent scramble for dominance. The rider reached for a knife, but Ryland grabbed his wrist and slammed his head against a stone until the man went limp, then staggered to his feet, breathing hard, ribs burning with each inhale. Another shot rang out and tore across Ryland's shoulder, spinning him halfway around, pain exploding white behind his eyes. But he didn't fall. He didn't have that luxury. He pushed forward, shoving adrenaline through every vein in his body as he fired his last 3 rounds in quick succession, dropping 2 men and forcing the rest to hold back just long enough for him to reach the porch steps. Mara flung open the door, pulled him inside, and shoved the heavy beam across the entrance just as bullets hammered the wooden boards, tearing through the walls in violent bursts that filled the room with splintered wood and choking dust. Jack cried out, and Rylan grabbed the boy, pulling him beneath the table as Mara ducked behind the stove, reloading her rifle with shaking hands, her breath jagged and fast. "They're too many," she gasped. Rylan wiped the blood from his face and checked his revolver, empty. "Ain't about numbers now," he said, voice gravel thick. "It's about time." Mara looked at him, confused, but before she could ask, the gunfire outside stopped. All at once, abrupt, terrifying. Silence smothered the house like a heavy blanket. Jack clung to Rylan's shirt, whispering, "Why did they stop?" Rylan listened, really listened, and his stomach sank as he heard the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps on the porch. Not many, just one. Heavy, confident, unhurried. Thorne Maddock, the man who never dirtied his hands unless it meant delivering the final blow. The boards creaked under Maddock's weight as he stepped to the door, and his voice slid through the cracks like a cold blade. "Creed," he called softly. "Last chance. Give me the well, and you die clean." Rylan met Mara's eyes. She shook her head violently, silently pleading. But Rylan rose anyway, blood dripping from his shoulder, dust clinging to every inch of him, and he positioned himself between the door and the family behind him. "You ain't gettin' the well, Maddock," he said, voice steady as stone. Outside, Maddock exhaled, a slow, amused sigh. "Then I take it from your corpse." The doorknob turned,